Now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Peggy Simonson. Peggy has been a volunteer with Citizens for Conservation for 16 years. She's a former president of CFC and continues to serve on the board of directors. Peggy is currently chair of CFC's Community Education Committee. Peggy?
Thanks, Liz. Jim, could you promote the slide? I want to, for those of you who are new to these programs, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about Chicago Living Corridors, which is the organization that is collaborating with the Barrington Library to do these quarterly programs. Thank you. There we go. Chicago Living Corridors' mission is to focus on private property. As you see, as most of the land in Illinois, we don't ignore the public restored properties like the forest preserves, but we're primarily focused on homeowners, helping people improve the habitat on their own properties in the greater Chicago area. This map is actually on the ChicagoLivingCorridors.org website, and it's interactive. Here you just see the dots, but there you can circle on a spot. For example, these green dots are the properties that have been approved as good habitat by Citizens for Conservation. The big red area down here are in the area of, the Conservation Foundation. So different organizations are doing the same thing of helping homeowners improve their habitat on their property. Next slide.
Are we gonna have to do this every time?
You should just have an arrow there, I would think would work.
No, it's not, it's beeping, not working.
Okay. Oh, go back. Chicago Living Corridors, we call it an umbrella organization because we don't actually do the work. We present these programs, but we are made up of these founding organizations. Citizens for Conservation is Jim's, and my organization, we have a program called Habitat Corridors. The Wildflower Preservation and Propagation Committee in McHenry County has the program called A Natural Garden in Your Yard. And this, you can't read it very well, but the Conservation Foundation has this program called Conservation at Home, and Wild Ones have their own programs too to help homeowners. And there are, in addition to these founding organizations, there are these other organizations that are part of Chicago Living Corridors, all with the focus on helping property owners improve the habitat in their yards. So if you have already improved your habitat, have a native garden, and would like to be a dot on the map, you need to do it through one of these organizations rather than directly. We don't do it with individuals. We accumulate a number of approved properties by an organization, and then have our map maker add them to the map together. So next slide. I might just say while we're waiting that several of these organizations actually use the Conservation at Home program. So what we're encouraging you to do is plant natives, and all of the plants that Jim's going to be talking about, not all of them, but the plants Jim is going to be talking about today are natives. Join one of these organizations if you'd like to get your native gardens on the map or get help improving. We don't do the physical work of planting things, but we give advice on what would work in your particular the situation in your yard. We also encourage volunteers. We don't have paid staff. We are a volunteer-run organization, and with the goal of doing all this coordinating. So you can see a lot more resources on the ChicagoLivingCorridors.org website. Not just the map, but there's all sorts of resources, lists of plants, lists of plant sales. Oh, and I might just mention while I'm doing promotions, on citizensforconservation.org, next week, March 1st, we will open our native plant sale. So you gardeners might be interested in seeing all of the variety of native plants that are available for pre-order. The sale itself is the first weekend in March. So you'll get more information about that on the Citizens for Conservation website. Chicago Living Corridors usually lists all of the native plant sales in the area, and I'm not sure if we have that up yet, but that'll be coming soon too. So with that, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our presenter tonight, Jim Vanderpool. He's a longtime volunteer and on the board of directors with Citizens for Conservation in Barrington and director of restoration. It's interesting that he's not a naturalist by education, but he's an expert on all the native plants, the butterflies, the bees, the birds in our CFC's preserves. And he travels to far off locations to explore other natural areas in the world. Best of all, Jim is always willing to take visitors on various tours to see how many butterflies you could spot or to learn the big picture about major restorations. I'd like to share a personal note. I have learned, when I'm out in the field with Jim, I've learned many of the rarer plants from him because he shares both the common and the botanic names of everything. So I have mental links to remember things that I hadn't known before. Mm-hmm. So today, Jim's going to discuss this fascinating plant group, Apiaceae, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which includes carrots and parsley that we know about, but a lot of other plants that you need to know about. Many of them are delicious and useful, but some are downright invasive and or toxic. So you'll learn a lot about how to tell the difference. And this program, as Liz said, is being recorded. So you'll be able to look back at it. And if you want to look at the photos again and identify the differences in the plants or listen again to the narrative, that'll be on the YouTube video. So with that, I am really pleased to introduce Jim.
All right. Again, I'm Jim Vanderpool. Thanks for the nice introduction, Peggy. I have been working on ecological restoration with Citizens for Conservation, which I'm going to abbreviate to CFC for the rest of the presentation, since 1987. So the emphasis of this program will be on our experience as CFC and our restoration. All right. The first question is, why learn plants by family? There are about 3,200 plants that can occur in the Chicago area. So if you're looking at a plant, you want to answer the question, why is this plant, so-and-so and not the other 3,199? Very difficult to do. So if you learn families, you can break down and it becomes easier to identify a given plant. I read one, as I was doing research for this, someone said that it actually creates neural pathways in the brain when you learn some of a plant family's traits, that it takes you to that when you see another member. So after that, then, why choose the carrot family as the first? Well, there's a couple of reasons. I consider it one of the other ones. And the reason I say that is, so the Illinois prairie, about 80% of the biomass, the vegetative cover of an Illinois prairie is made up of only 3 plant families: the grasses, the sunflower family, and the pea family. The other 178 plant families make up the remaining 20%. And where this becomes very important in our efforts to restore the native ecosystems is the tendency is to go with the 3 big families, and you get those, and you got about the right look, you've got about the right structure and the right biomass, but you don't have the biodiversity. So you have to bring in all members of these other families if you really want a diverse and rich ecosystem. Now, the prairie or the carrot family is not that well known in nature. So the state of Illinois produced a pamphlet, the Prairie Establishment and Landscaping Guide, back in 1997. And in that guide, they gave a long list of the plants that they recommend restoring. On that list, there was only 1 species from the carrot family. So it's kind of as I say, it's one of the other ones that it doesn't get, not a lot of people know about it. Now, the carrot family has great agricultural value. People are very familiar. The carrot, parsnip, celery, parsley, dill, fennel. And then here's something I learned. I knew that coriander and cilantro were the same species, but I never knew where that came from. The coriander is the seeds that have been dried and ground up, and that's what makes the spice. The cilantro is actually the fresh leaves and stems. And then who wouldn't like anise? That's the original raw material of licorice. I like this slide. The title of this slide is "Some Carrots Yet Are More Appreciated Than the Others." There's the carrot and the parsnip. The fun thing about this is both the carrot and the parsnip have wild strains, and both live in the Chicago area. In fact, they're actually quite common, and we're going to talk about them later. But I didn't know that. I knew that they were related, but our wild carrot is actually the same species as the one that was domesticated in Europe, whatever, 7,000 years ago, and people have been eating them ever since. All right, so now I'm going to move to, we're going to talk about our native species in the carrot family here in the Chicago area. We have species in every habitat: oak woods, prairies, and marshes. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our habitats. The state of Illinois is a kind of it was originally a mosaic of prairie, which is a grassland ecosystem, forest, and then since it's flat and it gets a lot of rain, a lot of marshes. Most of our forests in Illinois are oak woods. Oak woods are very open, sunny, a lot of understory underneath the oaks. There's not a big dense forest. Our oak woods, our prairies, and our marshes in Illinois have been decimated in the last 200 years. To give you a statistic, I once read that 99.97% of Illinois' 23 million acres of prairie was decimated. Most of our oak woods were also cut down and badly damaged. In the Chicago area, the Illinois portion of the Chicago area, there is no old growth forest left. Every single forest was damaged. You'll see individual oak trees that survived the logging, and you'll see some old oaks, but basically the habitat was destroyed. Our marshes have survived better because they're not as valuable for agriculture as the oak woods and the prairies were. But even so, most of them have been drained. And that's why we do this ecological restoration. We want to bring back the biodiversity that used to live here and that was damaged for agricultural and urban usage. So we're going to take this by habitat. Here are the native species that live in our oak woods. Our oak woods survived the devastation that the prairies suffered a little bit because some farmers like to keep some oak groves around. They use them for pasture for their livestock, and then they use the wood for firewood and whatnot. So our oak woods have survived a little bit better than the prairie. The oak groves in our nature preserves were all used as cow pastures before we purchased the land, or were donated the land. All right, so I'm going to start out with 3 species: the hairy sweet cicely, the honewort, and the black snakeroot. You'll notice that each plant and every native plant that's in this presentation will have a numerical rating. And that numeral, for instance, the hairy sweet Sicily is 4. This is very interesting science on this. The authors of the best treatment of the Illinois, Chicago area flowers worked for the Morton Arboretum, and one of them worked there, but before that worked for the US Army. And they were botanists, and they were hired to evaluate a property to see whether it should be preserved or whether it'd be okay if you build a playground on it. And they did that, and they went out and they'd look and they'd give their opinion, but they wanted something more objective. So what they did is they went through exhaustively, went all of the native plants that live in the Chicago area. They rated them and assigned a number that says how conservative the plant is. In other words, how likely is it that this plant is part of the original habitat, and how much could have been in a disturbed situation. You'll notice these 3, 4, 4, and 5, they live in habitats that are generally intact, but have suffered a lot of development or a lot of disturbance. So these 3, we don't really restore these. These will come, they come back in our grazed, our overgrazed oak woods on their own. Actually, the hairy sweet Sicily is a very pretty plant. If I see that, I'll collect some of that seed and I'll put it in the seed mix. But we don't make a great effort in restoring these 3 species. The next one, the exact opposite. I consider this plant, the yellow pimpernel, a CFC success story. This plant, as you can see, the ecological integrity rating is a 10. On a scale of 0 to 10, it's at the top. You will not see this plant unless you see an intact, surviving remnant of one of our habitats. It has a very specialized habitat. It likes the edge of woods. It doesn't like the interior, the dense woods. It needs a lot of sun. And it'll grow in our oak grove, and it'll grow in the prairies that are adjacent to the oak grove. It won't grow too far away from the oaks, though. And it's a very nice plant, and we have done really well. We found a tiny little population that just happened to be about, I don't know, maybe a mile away from our top prairie preserve, our Grigsby Prairie. And we collected that, and it's done incredibly well. This very uncommon, rare plant now grows by the hundreds on our preserves. And one thing that's really, it's wonderful being with CFC is we have some of the most mature ecological restorations in the Chicago area. So we actually have big surpluses of seed of native plants on our properties. We will donate more than half of the seed we collect to other nature organizations to improve their properties. We donate the seed. And it's kind of, this is one of our signature seeds. Basically, if you see the yellow pimpernel in the Chicago area, it's probably come from our seed. That's how uncommon it is. And it's another fun thing is we picked this in the fall. Another neat thing about this plant, you think of fall color foliage as being like a maple or an aspen in the fall. Oddly enough, the yellow pimpernel's got beautiful fall color. It's got kind of the color of a red maple. Its leaves will turn in the fall. And when you pick the seeds have a wonderful smell, a real fresh smell, exactly like its relative, the celery. So the seed picking day when we go after the yellow pimpernel is one of the most popular work days. The last of our native carrots that we live in the oak woods is a plant called the cow parsnip. I got to show you the picture of this. This picture, love this picture. One of our volunteers and members, Donna Bolzman, took this picture, and this really shows what we're doing here. So here is an oak woods. See, notice how far apart the trees are. These are mature trees. These are ones that go back to the beginning of the pioneer days. These trees are probably 150, 175 years old. And we have restored this, that the plant with the big, broad, and heavily indented leaves is the cow parsnip. And it's, as you can see, it's all through this grove. And then if you look real carefully on this picture, I love this photo because it really shows what restoration's doing. So this is the open oak grove. Beyond it, and this little band here on the green is a prairie. It's our best prairie on this preserve. And beyond that is an even older oak grove, which we call the original grove. It's an interesting habitat. It goes back before the pioneers, and it was a known winter, summer fishing and hunting camp for the Potawatomi Indians. We found several times, we found arrowheads here where they'd hunt here. And so this shows a good feel for what we're talking about with oak woods, very open, sunny prairie, and then another oak woods. I absolutely love this plant, the cow parsnip. It's got a bad reputation because as you can see, it's very aggressive. It does extremely well. And people are worried it's going to take over, that it can be kind of weedy. Notice that its ecological rating was only a 5, which is kind of borderline between a little bit weedy that tolerates disturbance and an intact native area. But I've seen this plant. This is a very widespread plant. It doesn't just live here. I've seen this plant in Denali National Park, Mount Rainier National Park, Yellowstone National Park, some of America's most pristine wildernesses, and this plant's there. So I'm a big fan. The other thing that I like about it, this plant is absolutely beloved by insects, pollinators, and herbivores. It just teems with insects. The book that I've used as my source is the best treatment of the plants of the Chicago area. It's called Flora of the Chicago Region by Wilhelm and Rarica. Ms. Rarica, she did an exhaustive study of what insects use what plants. Her list of the insects that use this plants is so long. I've just written down a part of them. Leaf beetles, flower beetles, longhorn beetles, pirate bugs, ebony bugs, many, many species of ants, many, many species of bees, wasps, and even a leaf miner fly. So this plant brings in the insects, which serve as the prey for birds, other animals. It's a big part of the food web. Another herbivore that loves it is deer. That's another thing that endears me about this plant is deer. We've learned one thing, that they love to browse our native plants. Love it. They greatly prefer native plants to the non-native. But what deer do is they have their favorite, and they will eat all of their favorite, and then they move to the next favorite. Well, this is their favorite. So when this plant is coming up, the deer will eat it, and they stay away from all of our rarer plants. So my brother, who led our restoration effort for many, many years, he had a great line about this plant. He said it falls on its sword. For the rare plants, it saves them because it gets pounded. But the great thing is it comes right back. And this plant, you should see this picture is probably taken in the second week of May. In the second week of June, it blooms. It's got huge stalks that go up about 5-6 feet. And then it's got big white flowers in the form of an umbrella that is like the size of a dinner plate. So I'm a big fan of this plant. All right, let's move to the next habitat, prairies. A very attractive plant that grows in our prairies is the golden Alexander. I have coined the phrase that it's one of the successful seven. And why I say that is when people started trying to restore prairie, they found out that plants that bloom in the spring don't do well. They're hard to restore. And what's, one of the things that's really nice about the Illinois prairie is it blooms. It starts blooming at the end of April, blooms in May, June, and it goes all the way until the end of October. But the spring blooming flowers are the hardest to restore. So it's important to have them because the pollinators, they need, the longer they have access to food, the better. So it's really important to have these plants blooming in the spring. So Golden Alexander is one of our best. The yellow pimpernel is also on my list of the successful seven. So two of this family member are on the successful seven. All right, the next one, maybe my favorite plant that we're going to talk about, the heart-leafed Alexander. I call it, notice its rating is a 10. It's a great rarity. This plant only lives in the very highest quality, most intact prairies. And how did we get it? Well, I'm going to show you a picture. It's kind of interesting. Beautiful plant. This plant was so rare, we didn't even know what it was. When we started, we didn't know what it was. A really high quality prairie was about to be destroyed to widen a highway. And we transplanted some sods from the prairie into our restoration. We didn't transplant this plant. It came by accident. We transplanted 3 plants, the shooting star, the hoary cocoon, and the prairie fox. This one came up by accident. It was in the sod. And then my father, who was a real dedicated gardener, he liked the plant. He didn't know what it was. And he found out what it was. And he said, I wonder if I can grow this. So he took some seeds from it and he grew it inside, and he produced 2 flats of about 10 specimens in each flat. And my brother and I, we transplanted these into our beginning prairie restorations. And it was a drought year. It was hot and dry. I didn't think they were going to survive. That was about 25 years ago. Well, about 5 years ago, I looked for these plants. I said, what the heck? I wonder if they survive. And the great thing was, not only did they survive, but they were thriving. They were slowly spreading. Of those 10 specimens that we planted, almost all survived. And then around them were like 10 seedlings that had come up. So now we went from 10 to 100. So I tried to figure out, why is it how only one parent is responsible for all of the heartleaf Alexanders on our preserves? How could it be so fertile on its seeds? And then I noticed that every time I saw this plant blooming, it was swarming with pollinators, but they weren't the famous pollinators that most people know. The bumblebees don't like it, honeybees don't like it, butterflies don't like it, but they were always swarming with these little bees, miniature bees. And you can see this in this photo is by one of our other members, Steve Barton, a really good wildlife photographer. And you can see these tiny bees here. Well, you can't get a book that shows these little bees. They're hard to identify. But when Flora of the Chicago region came out, I looked and said, what insects are associated with this plant? And sure enough, there were 4 species of bees from 3 different genera. And I looked them all up on the internet, and I'm almost absolutely sure that these little bees that you see in this picture are one of those 4. It doesn't even have a common name. It's the Nomada articulata, which I guess would translate to the clear nomad bee, but no one uses that. It's only known by its Latin name. But sure enough, this bee only lives in high quality prairies. So somehow this plant, somehow this little bee survived, and it's come into our restoration, and it is, effectively pollinating these heartleaf Alexander. For the first time 2 years ago, I said there's enough of them growing, and we can start collecting seed, and we're going to put it in our seed mix. So hopefully we'll get more of these. This is a very rare plant. Okay, the next plant, not quite a 10, but a 9, and another, it's an iconic prairie plant, the Rattlesnake Master. And this one, I'm going to go to its picture. This is another really fine picture by Steve Barton. This plant is doing extremely well. This is a rare plant in nature. It's a 9. When a plant's rated a 9, you will not see it unless you're in a high quality prairie or in a real good restoration like ours, where we've got them, and it's pretty common. And this plant, there's no mysteries about the pollinators here. Every pollinator loves this plant. It's crazy. This plant, bumblebees, honeybees, paper wasps, on and on, Midas flies. Every time when this plant's blooming, it's just swarming with insects. So I couldn't figure out why is it. It's not that showy of flowers, you can see. And to me, it has no noticeable aroma. So why is it so popular? I've never been able to figure out why it's so popular with pollinators. Well, here, the real science met with our citizen science, which is, us just thinking and surmising. In this year, 2021, our Barrington Greenway Initiative, which is a partnership that CFC is leading, we commissioned some real scientists to come out and do a survey because we had discovered a federal endangered species, the rusty-patched bumblebee, on our preserve. So we wanted to see how it was doing, and they just came out with their results, and it turns out we have the 2 best populations in a 2-county area on our 2 little preserves of the rusty-patched bumblebee. But here's something they found out. Rattlesnake Master is one of the 7 plants that most were visited by this endangered species bumblebee. And it turns out that it doesn't, unlike most plants, it's collecting the pollen, not the nectar of this. So now I wonder if plants give a different signal to insects that want pollen than they do nectar. They don't have to have the showy flower. They don't have to have the aroma. Maybe they're giving something out. So if anyone would ever want to research that, I'd love to know is that possible, that this plant specializes in providing pollen. And then what the researcher said is that pollen is very important because bumblebees eat nectar when they're adults, but they feed pollen to their larvae so that it's a different stage of development, needs a different food. So that's one of my favorites, Rattlesnake Master. All right, I'm going to move on. Our third habitat, maybe the top habitat for the carrot family, are the marshes. We have these 5 species. The first one, the great angelica, aptly named. It's a great plant. Another one, kind of like cow parsnip, very tall, a big flower that's the size of a softball. And it's very easy to restore. This is a plant that in nature is pretty rare, and it's doing very well in our restorations. I would say it's probably one of the only plants where if you see it around here, the odds are pretty good that you're seeing a restoration, because it's an uncommon plant, but it's quite common in our restorations. And now we're getting to the toxics. All right, the water parsnip is non-toxic. The very similar cowbane, toxic, dangerous. the very similar water hemlock is the most toxic plant in North America. This is a deadly plant. When I was doing my research, Carol Rice forwarded me an article, and they said that water hemlock was used in the Iroquois Nation as a method to commit suicide when you'd been disgraced. They call it, the author of this book, that was from the Seneca Nation of the Iroquois Confederation, said this plant, there's nothing good about this plant. This plant, you eat it and you die 2 hours later. I also found the wispy water hemlock, and I thought that the water hemlock was the most toxic. Well, the even rarer wispy water hemlock is just as toxic. So one thing that this raised a point, there's kind of a controversy in the Chicago natural area community. A lot of people, it's kind of a fad right now is to forage, to go out and find wild plants and eat them. And I'm kind of against that, only because in Illinois, our wild plants, our native plants have been so destroyed. We just can't afford to, have people eat. We've got a population of 8 million. If 1 in 1,000 eats these, all of these plants are rare. They can't handle that kind of harvesting. But then I thought, well, what's one plant group that you definitely don't want to forage? And that's this. Let me show you these. Here is the harmless and said to be tasty water parsnip. Here's the cowbane, dangerous. And here is the deadly water hemlock. Now, if you're going to forage these, better be pretty confident about your plant identification skills. They're not easy to tell apart. So this is one you definitely don't want to forage. All right. So let's move on. Those are the natives that we have on our preserve that we've restored. What are we missing? When the flora of the Chicago region came out, my brother and I went through it one by one, all 3,200 species, and tried to figure out what plants, when we collected and that we've established at our preserves, what plants should be here. In other words, they are in our 2 counties, Lake and Cook County, and they are in our habitats, oak woods, prairie, or marsh. And we were originally going to try to find like 50, and we decided, 50's not quite right. There's 60 that we would really want. So I coined the phrase, the sought after 60. So these are plants that we don't have in our preserves, and we would want them. You can tell by their ratings, 8, 10, and 8. These are rare plants. They have very specialized habitat. They get this, the thicket parsley only lives in the bare spot around a mature tree's trunk where it gets real dry, and it grows just in a little ring around the trunk of a tree. The meadow parsnip only lives in open oak woods that are marshy, that are wet. So I personally have never seen these plants growing wild in our area. But this is one good thing. When we published the sought after 60 list of the 60 plants that we wanted to get, one of our partner organizations, the Friends of Somme, they have even a better seed program than we do. And they read that and they said, oh, we like your list. Do you guys want some seed? And they gave us some seed for thicket parsley and meadow parsnip. No one has prairie parsley. I think that it's possible that plant could be extinct in the Chicago area. But anyways, we got some seed. We took half the seed and of the meadow parsnip and all of the seed of the thicket parsley. And we have a cooperative agreement with the Lake County Forest Preserves. They have a rare plant nursery, and they grow rare plants for restoration there. We gave them half of our meadow parsnip and all of our thicket parsley seed, and they're growing them. I took the other half of them out of parsnip, and I had a perfect spot for it. A nice, sunny, open woods that had a marsh vegetation under it. And I put some seed in there last year. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting these, at least these two. That'd be great. So that's what we're missing. Okay, I'm going to move on. And we've talked about the good. That's the marsh, woods, and prairie natives. We've talked about the toxic. What about the bad? There's a lot of non-native species of plants in the Chicago area because the habitat's so disturbed. But these four are worthy of note. As I said before, the Queen Anne's lace is the wild carrot. It's actually the plant that was domesticated to have our delicious carrot. It is an extremely common plant in the Chicago area. I would think it's probably the most common, widespread, and familiar wildflower in the whole Chicago area. Note that I say it forced a change to our prairie restoration practices. It loves to live in hay meadows. Hay meadows are formed by plants that the European brought to the New World. They think it made better forage for their livestock. And they brought the Queen Anne's lace with, and it's in every hay meadow. So our first prairie restoration was at Grigsby Prairie. We started out doing what was considered state of the art at that time, back in 1987, that you plow it and then you disc it. And that wipes out a lot of the plants. It wipes out some of the bad plants in a hay meadow that you want to get rid of. But it doesn't wipe out Queen Anne's lace. Queen Anne's lace is an annual. It's very fast growing. When you plow and disc land, it explodes, and it grows hundreds to a square meter. It's an incredibly abundant plant in severely disturbed soils. So we actually after a while we said it just doesn't work. The plant, our seedlings of our native plants, they don't compete in the first couple of years against the Queen Anne's lace. So we started just sowing our seed into the hay meadow. We don't plow it anymore. And that's really worked. The Queen Anne's lace is fading, but it doesn't go away. Like, for instance, if we mow a trail in the prairie, it comes up in the trail. So the seed bank's there. Another invasive, the non-native plant, the Japanese hedge parsley. It's a dangerous newcomer. When we first started this, it didn't even live around here. It's invaded since we started, and it likes the same things. It likes open oak woods. So that's a plant. We pull it out. We're trying to control it. The wild parsnip. The wild parsnip is also toxic, but it acts in a different way. It has a juice that when it's stimulated by sunlight or when it's heated by sunlight, it causes a severe rash. And I've got this. I went wild parsnip one time. I didn't know that our workday was going to be pulling out wild parsnip. So I had a short sleeve shirt on, some great leather gloves, but one stem of the wild parsnip brushed against my forearm above the glove. By the end of the day, I had a horrible rash that went across my entire forearm. It was really strange. It's not painful, and it didn't even itch, but it's really ugly. It's a terrible rash, and that rash lasts the whole rest of the year, and I could even see it fading 2 years later. So that's why my comment here: do not touch this plant in the sunlight. There's another invasive, the giant hogweed. I say knock on wood because I have yet to see this on our preserves, but other people are reporting it. It's supposedly even a worse causer of rashes than the wild parsnip. So I hope it doesn't invade our area. So that's the bad. Now we've talked about the good, the bad, and the toxic. Here are some pictures. So here's the Queen Anne's lace. I'm sure you've seen it before. It's one of our most common plants. And this is another great photo by Steve Barton. He gets these detailed photos that can tell so much of a story. So that insect there, that's not even a native ladybug. So here's the non-native European plant. And what insect do you see? The Asian multicolored lady beetle. So now you got a non-native plant with a non-native beetle. What's the harm of that? I got to show you, I'll show you this next slide, and it really brings up an issue. Here's the wild parsnip. This is the bird. This is a female bobolink. A bobolink's a great bird. It's on a list of birds of concern, grassland birds throughout the Americas that are declining because our grasslands have degraded. And you'll notice that this picture illustrates two interesting points. Birds are not that conservative. They care about the structure, they care about the habitat, but they don't necessarily care that a plant's not native. You routinely see bobolinks sitting on a hayfield on top of wild parsnip, because wild parsnip will grow higher than the other plants. The other point this illustrates is, look what this detailed photo shows. What is this female bobolink holding in its bill? That is a caterpillar. Bobolinks, adult bobolinks mainly eat seeds. In fact, this bird is one of the great migrants in the world. This bird nests here in Illinois, even farther north, and it winters, it flies all the way through the United States, across the Gulf of Mexico, all the way across northern South America, crosses the Amazon, and migrates all the way to the subtropical grasslands of Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, southern Brazil, northern Argentina. There, it's called the rice bird because it eats rice and is considered a pest. Here, the adults mainly eat seeds, but note that it's feeding its babies, caterpillar. And this is true with all the seed-eating birds. When it comes to nesting, they feed their babies. They're carnivores. They feed insects because that the nesting season. This bird starts nesting in the middle of May. It's gone by the 4th of July because it's got to fly all the way down to Bolivia. So that their babies have to, I'm sure, 6-tuple, septuple, 8-octuple in size in about 6 weeks. So they have to have an incredibly high protein, mineral, calorie diet. And that's why it's so important to do ecological restoration. The bobolink doesn't mind sitting on a wild parsnip, but if you just have wild parsnip, you're not going to have enough insects. You're going to have a depauperate vegetative habitat is going to have a depauperate insect population. The birds are not going to have enough seeds, or excuse me, enough insects to eat. So they're going to decline in their breeding success. And that's why we do restoration. It's good for the birds, even though the birds aren't that conservative. It's good to have the conservative plants because they bring in a wider diversity of insects, which get more food for the birds. Here, and this, I just want to show you this picture. It's just another wild parsnip picture, but here's the male of the bobolink. I think it's one of the most beautiful birds in the world. It's also got an absolutely gorgeous song that they sing on flight. And it's another cool thing about it. It's one of the only birds that's dark on the bottom and light on the back. Most animals are darker from above, so they blend in from the ground when they're being attacked from the sky, but lighter from below when they're attacked from the ground. This is an odd exception. Great bird. Okay, and then we're going to move to the last, perfect timing. I'm just about done. I'm going to go to the last slide. Many of our listeners, many of our CFC members are interested in wildflower gardens. So what about the garden? For the carrot family, I mean, I think you can tell, I love the carrot family. I think it's so great. But for gardening, it's not one of the best. And I'll tell you why. Since they're one of the other ones, and they're always, they're not the dominant plant. They have a tendency to grow up in dense vegetation and tower above. You saw how that wild parsnip, it's up above the grasses of the hay meadow. Same thing with the great angelica, the cow parsnip. Their flowers, they've got a long stem that goes up. Their flowers are up above. What happens when you put them in a garden, they don't have the support of all that lush vegetation like sedges and plants and grass that go up 2-3 feet. So in a garden, they tend to flop over. Even one of my all-time favorite plants, the Rattlesnake Master, it gets pretty floppy in a garden, even though it's propped up so well in the native habitat. Now, the one exception would be if you've got a rain garden and you've got a nice population of sedge or marsh grasses, then some of those would go in pretty well because they'll get propped up. And then my other favorite plant, the heartleaf Alexander, that's such a beautiful plant. That would probably be great in a garden because it's got that low center of gravity and it won't flop over. But, that's not an easy plant to get. It's such a rare plant. It's not easy to get that one. So that's my thoughts on gardening. Everyone's, that's just my opinion. If you have a good prairie garden that has grass and has, then they're fine. But in a classic perennial garden, they're not one of the great gardening plants families. So now that concludes, and I've got 5 minutes for questions if we want to do that.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm looking to see here. I'm not seeing a lot of questions in the chat. If anyone had any questions that they would like to throw out there, that would be wonderful. I do have one question from Barb. Can you tell us about the other 5 successful 7?
Yeah, sure. When I talk about the spring flowers are not a taxonomic group. They're you could call them a cohort. That's something that botanists use sometimes. So they're not related, but the other members of the successful 7 are a shooting star, which is in the primrose family, and at CFC's advocacy is, I think it's named the village flower of Barrington. The common blue-eyed grass, that's in the iris family. The Jacob's ladder, which is a woodland plant, but it can also grow in prairies. I'm going to look on my list. I've got this written down, so sometimes I forget. The prairie lousewort is in the snapdragon family. That's a great plant. That's doing really well. That took a long, long time. When I say successful 7, they don't come right away. I'm saying after 25 years, they're beginning to become more common. And then another a beautiful plant, the wild hyacinth, which is in the lily family. And then our 2 carrots. So these plants, as I said, the first one to come is Golden Alexander, maybe takes 7-8 years. And then the other ones, I've been told that the shooting star comes, it takes 7 years from time of germination to its first bloom. So, I mean, they've got some of these prairie plants they're as old as trees. It's crazy. So that's the successful 7.
Thank you. I've got another question here. Is it safe to eat the white carrot of Queen Anne's lace?
That's a great question. And when I talk to the kids on the fourth grader on the prairie, we take all the fourth graders in the Barrington Elementary School District out on the prairie. I've kind of got the hang of what kids like. So right if they look like they're getting a tiny bit bored, I'll reach over on the trail because the Queen Anne's lettuce will grow along the trail, and I'll pull one out and I say, "This is a carrot." The kids go nuts and they always say, "Hey, can we eat that? Can we eat that?" But I have heard that really it's not that good. It's very bitter. It has some crystals in it that have been selectively bred out, even though it's the same species. I've heard that it's really not a very good vegetable. I don't think it's not toxic the way the water hemlocks are, but I've heard it's not so good. And then I don't know, I wanted to research that on the parsnip, whether the wild parsnip is edible. I would think not, because the grocery store parsnip is probably 5-6 times bigger than the wild parsnip. Root, probably been selectively bred for edibility.
Great. Peggy's wondering if you'd be willing to show us the photos again of the toxic plants.
Okay. All right, here's the cowbane. This is dangerous. I've heard that it will, you'll have severe distress from this plant. And here's the plant that was used for suicide. Water hemlock. Guess what? The famous poison hemlock, which is famously Socrates chose to eat rather than be exiled. According to this one source, the poison hemlock is a wonderful way to go compared to the water hemlock. The water hemlock is apparently not only deadly, but it's also causes a severe pain and agony, where apparently the poison hemlock, it just causes you to stop breathing and you pass out, and it's kind of a peaceful, painless way to go. According to Wilhelm and Rarica, the poison hemlock lives in Chicago area. I've never seen it. I've looked for it. I've never seen it growing wild, but it does grow wild in the Chicago area.
I've got a question here. Is our native angelica the one that is often grown as an herb?
I don't think so. No, I can't. It's really interesting. You notice that so many of these, we got the wild carrot, wild parsnip, we've got the great angelica. It's probably the same genus, but I don't think, I've never run across anyone foraging that one. So I'm guessing that it's in the same genus, but not the same species. But I just don't know. I mean, the prairie parsley is not the same species as the parsley that we use as a garnish. But again, it's closely related. I've never seen the coriander plant. I don't know what that looks like. That doesn't grow wild in the Chicago area. I mean, it does, but it's very rare. And then I remember I used to live in California, and the anise, the raw material of licorice, is a common invasive in California. It grows along the side of the road. You can smell the licorice smell.
Interesting. Douglas is wondering if you medicated your rash from the wild parsnip.
No,
possibly because they're worried about it as well.
Yeah, I did put a some kind of like a burn, and it didn't seem to do any good. That's the oddest thing to see anything last that long, the last 2 years. That's a burn. But no, that whatever I put on it didn't help.
And then Kimberly's wondering if all members of the carrot family survive in the prairie, or if some do require a forest environment. I know that you'd mentioned one, I thought.
Yeah, they do have a strong tendency to like the open woods. There are no wild carrots in the Chicago area that live in our few, we've got a few what I call closed woods in the Chicago area. There aren't any carrots family members that live in those closed woods. They like it open, they like the sun.
I think that's all the questions that I have here. Peggy, would you like to talk about, there was a couple slides I thought at the end about
Yeah,
our next
there you go.
program.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. That's really good information.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone for attending. I'm happy to do it.
Okay. We're doing these programs quarterly now. So the next one is in May, on May 26th. They're usually the third or the fourth Thursday of the month at 7 p.m. And the next one is about green infrastructure. Basically, Jeff Weiss is currently now the coordinator of the Flint Creek Spring Creek Watersheds Partnership. But he has done a lot of work in infrastructure for wetlands, for improving the watershed. So this will be an informative program about the photo you're seeing here is the making of a rain garden. By infrastructure, we don't mean buildings. We mean whatever is needed to improve the habitat, but in a green way rather than a cement wall or something. So we'll have more information coming out on the email that Liz sends ahead of time for the program, but put May 26th on your calendar.